I never thought I would see my parents again, certainly not like this, standing 10 feet away from me in a courtroom, whispering with those tight, satisfied smiles I used to recognize from childhood. They thought they had finally found a way back into my life. Not for me, not for my son, for $3.2 million. They believed the law would be on their side. They believed I was still the same frightened 16-year-old girl they had pushed out into the cold. They didn't know who I had become. And they definitely didn't know that in just a few moments the judge would look at me and say the words that would drain the color from their faces. "Good morning, Admiral." The first thing I noticed wasn't their voices. It was the way they stood. My mother still held her purse like it was something fragile and valuable, clutched close to her chest. With both hands, her fingers curled tight around the leather straps. My father stood slightly ahead of her chin, lifted just enough to suggest confidence, but not enough to mask the tension in his jaw. They hadn't aged the way I expected. Not softer, not kinder. Just sharper in different places, like life had carved lines into them, but hadn't smoothed anything out. 20 years. That's how long it had been since I last stood within arm's reach of them. 20 years since the night they told me to leave. 20 years since I stood on that porch with a plastic grocery bag full of clothes and nowhere else to go. And now here we were. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and cleaning solution, the kind that tries to cover up something older beneath it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. People moved around us in quiet, purposeful steps, lawyers with folders tucked under their arms, clerks balancing stacks of files. Strangers who had no idea they were walking through the middle of a story that had been building for 2 decades. I stood alone on my side of the hallway, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I had chosen a simple navy suit that morning, nothing flashy, nothing that called attention. My hair was pinned back neatly the way I had learned to do years ago when presentation stopped being about vanity and started being about discipline. My posture was straight, not forced, just practiced. Across from me, my parents stood with their attorney. He was exactly the kind of man you expect in a case like this, tall, polished silver tie clip, catching the light every time he shifted. He spoke in low, confident tones, occasionally leaning in toward them as if sharing strategy. My father nodded along his expression, tightening with each word, while my mother murmured something under her breath, her lips barely moving. They looked prepared. Prepared to take something from me. Prepared to win. My mother glanced up and met my eyes. For a moment something flickered there, recognition, maybe even hesitation, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by something colder. "You always did think you were better than everyone else," she said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. Her voice hadn't changed. Still clipped, still precise, still carrying that same sharp edge that used to make me feel smaller than I was. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I had learned over the years that silence can carry more weight than any argument. My father stepped forward slightly, placing himself just a little more in front of her like he always had. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said, his tone measured, almost reasonable. "You know what's fair." Fair. The word landed between us like something misplaced. I looked at him, really looked this time. The gray in his hair was more pronounced now, the lines around his eyes deeper. But the expression, the certainty that he was right, that he had authority, that he could still define the terms of my life, that hadn't changed at all. "No," I said calmly, "I know what's legal." His jaw tightened. "That's not the same thing," he replied. "Sometimes it is," I said. Before he could answer, the courtroom doors opened and a clerk stepped out, calling for everyone to begin moving inside. The hallway shifted, conversations cut short, papers gathered, shoes turning toward the same direction. This was it. As we filed into the courtroom, I became aware of the quiet that settled over the room. Not complete silence, there were still whispers, the soft creak of wooden benches, the rustle of fabric, but it felt contained, like everything was holding its breath. I took my seat. Across from me, my parents sat beside their attorney. My mother leaned in close to him, whispering something that made him nod once confidently. My father folded his hands on the table, his posture rigid, eyes forward. They were still smiling. Not broadly, not openly, but there was something there, a satisfaction, a belief that this was the moment things would finally tilt back in their favor. That they would finally be proven right. I rested my hands in my lap steady. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." The entire room stood as the judge entered his robes, moving softly with each step. He took his seat behind the bench, adjusted a stack of papers, and glanced briefly around the courtroom. For a moment, everything felt suspended. Time breath, thought. Then his gaze landed on me. And something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But I saw it, the recognition, the respect, the quiet acknowledgement of who I was beyond this room, beyond this case. He gave a small, deliberate nod. "Good morning," he began, his voice even. Then, looking directly at me, he added, "Admiral." The word didn't echo. It didn't need to. It settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything. Across the aisle, my mother froze. Her fingers tightened around her purse knuckles, whitening as her grip instinctively increased. My father's head turned sharply toward me, his expression shifting not all at once, but piece by piece. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked dangerously close to fear. Their attorney blinked just once, the confidence in his posture faltering for the briefest moment. No one spoke. No one moved. And in that suspended second, I saw it clearly, the exact moment when the version of me they had carried in their minds for 20 years finally shattered. The girl they had thrown out. The mistake they had erased. The daughter they had decided wasn't worth keeping. She wasn't the one sitting in this courtroom anymore. And for the first time since I was 16 years old, I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not anger, not triumph. Something quieter. Something steadier. Closure, maybe? Or the beginning of it. Because the truth was, this moment, the recognition, the shift in power, the look on their faces, it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't change the night they closed the door behind me. But it did something else. It made it impossible for them to pretend they still had the right to define who I was. And as I stood there in that courtroom under that single word, Admiral, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. They hadn't come back into my life. Not really. They had walked into a life they no longer understood. And they were about to find out just how much had changed. The night they threw me out, it wasn't loud. That's the part people always get wrong when they imagine stories like mine. They picture shouting slammed doors, maybe something breaking, something dramatic enough to match the kind of wound it leaves behind. But real damage doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, with voices kept low and words chosen carefully, like they're trying not to disturb the neighbors while they dismantle your life. It was late October, the kind of night where the air already carries the bite of November. The sky outside our kitchen window had that heavy, empty look to it, like it was holding back rain but hadn't decided whether to let it fall yet. The house smelled faintly of coffee that had gone cold on the counter, mixed with whatever my mother had cooked earlier that evening. I remember standing just inside the kitchen doorway, my hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles ached. I kept staring at them, like if I focused hard enough I might disappear into them. My mother sat at the table, her arms crossed, her back straight. She didn't look angry. Not exactly. Anger would have been easier. Anger has heat to it. This was colder than that. Controlled. Measured. My father stood behind her, pacing slowly the same way he used to when he was trying to solve a problem he didn't like. Neither of them said the word pregnant. It hung in the room anyway, thick and undeniable like smoke. "You've embarrassed us," my mother said finally, her voice calm, almost clinical. I swallowed, but my throat felt dry. "I didn't mean... You didn't think my father cut in stopping mid-step? That's the problem." His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of finality, the kind that doesn't invite discussion. "I'm going to take care of it," I said quickly, the words tumbling over each other. "I'll get a job, I can still finish school, This isn't about school," my mother said. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto mine. "This is about what people will say." There it was. Not my future. Not my safety. Not the fact that I was 16 years old and terrified and trying to understand how my life had changed overnight. People. Neighbors, church friends. The women she saw every Sunday who smiled politely and took mental notes on everything. My father exhaled sharply. "You've made your choice," he said. I blinked. "What?" "You're keeping it, aren't you?" The way he said it, like the baby inside me was an inconvenience, a stain, something I had chosen to carry just to spite them, made something in my chest tighten. I don't know yet, I admitted, my voice smaller now. That was the wrong answer. My mother leaned back in her chair, her lips pressing into a thin line. You don't know, she repeated, as if testing the words and finding them unacceptable. Silence filled the room again. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than it should have. Finally, my father spoke. If you stay here, he said slowly, this becomes our problem. I felt my stomach drop. I am your daughter, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. My mother's eyes flickered for just a second, but whatever was there disappeared almost immediately. Not if you go through with this, she said. There it was. Not a threat, not a warning. A condition. Something in me cracked, but it didn't make a sound. I don't have anywhere else to go, I whispered. My father walked past me, then heading toward the hallway. He didn't look at me as he spoke. You do tonight. My mother stood up, smoothing her blouse like she was preparing to leave for church. You'll pack a bag, she said. Only what you need. My hand started to shake. You can't be serious, I said, my voice rising just a little. It's cold outside. I don't even have... You should have thought about that, she replied. No anger, no hesitation. Just a statement. I looked between them, waiting, hoping for something to shift, for one of them to soften, to step back, to say they didn't mean it. Neither of them did. So I packed. A plastic grocery bag from under the sink, a few shirts, a pair of jeans, underwear, a sweater that wasn't thick enough for the weather. I moved through my room in a daze, my mind trying to catch up with what was happening, but never quite managing to. When I came back to the front door, they were already there. My father opened it without a word. Cold air rushed in immediately, sharp against my skin. For a second, I just stood there, waiting. Go, my mother said quietly. I stepped out onto the porch. The wood creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that suddenly felt foreign. Behind me, the door closed. Not slammed, just closed. And that was it. No hug, no last words, no moment of reconsideration. Just the quiet click of a lock turning. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the door like it might open again. It didn't. So I walked. I didn't have a plan, not really, just a direction. Grandma's house? It was 1.5 miles away, down a road lined with tall maples that had already started shedding their leaves. The wind pushed them across the pavement as I walked, their dry edges scraping softly against the ground. My fingers went numb first. Then my ears. I pulled the thin sweater tighter around myself, but it didn't help much. By the time I reached her porch, I was shivering so hard my teeth were chattering. I raised my hand and knocked. Once. Twice. The door opened before I could knock a third time. Grandma Margaret stood there in her house slippers and an old cardigan, her gray hair pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck. She looked at me. Just looked. Her eyes moved from my face to the bag in my hand, then back again. She didn't ask a single question. She stepped aside. Come in, baby, she said softly. That was it. No judgment. No disappointment. Just space. Warmth. I walked inside and the heat hit me immediately, wrapping around me like something alive. The house smelled like cinnamon and something savory, something familiar. The kind of smell that tells you you're safe before anyone has to say it. I didn't realize I was crying until she pulled me into her arms. My body just gave out. I collapsed against her, the bag slipping from my hand onto the floor as everything I had been holding in finally broke loose. She held me like she'd been waiting for it. Like she knew. I've got you, she whispered, one hand resting gently on the back of my head. You hear me? I've got you. I nodded against her shoulder, unable to speak. She guided me to the couch, wrapped a blanket around me, and disappeared into the kitchen. A minute later, she came back with a mug of tea, steam curling up into the air. Drink, she said, placing it in my hands. My fingers trembled around the ceramic, but I did as she said. She sat beside me close enough that I could feel the steady warmth of her presence. You're not alone, she said after a moment. Not as long as I'm breathing. The words settled into me slow and heavy. For the first time since I had stood in that kitchen hours earlier, something inside me loosened. Fear didn't disappear. Neither did the uncertainty. But there was something else now, too. Something steadier. Something I hadn't expected to find that night. Safety. And as I sat there wrapped in her blanket, holding that warm mug between my hands, I realized something I wouldn't fully understand until years later. That moment standing on her porch being let in without question didn't just change where I would sleep that night. It changed everything that came after. Because when one door closes quietly behind you and another opens just as quietly in front of you, you learn something most people never have to. You learn exactly who is willing to catch you and who isn't. When my son was born, the room didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like exhaustion. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the steady beep of a monitor, the faint antiseptic smell that clung to everything inside that hospital. My body ached in ways I didn't have the language to explain, and my mind was somewhere between relief and disbelief, like I had crossed a line I didn't fully understand. I was 16 years old, and I was a mother. Grandma stood beside the bed, her hand wrapped around mine the entire time, steady and warm like an anchor I didn't realize I needed until I had it. She didn't say much during the delivery. She didn't have to. Every squeeze of her hand, every quiet nod, every soft, "You're doing just fine, baby," carried more weight than any speech ever could. When they finally placed him in my arms, everything else faded. He was small, smaller than I expected. His skin was warm, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around nothing, like he was already reaching for something he hadn't learned to name yet. I stared at him, at the soft rise and fall of his chest, at the way his eyes fluttered, not fully open, not fully closed, at the quiet, fragile certainty that he was here now and that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. Grandma leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did it," she said. "You hear me? You did it." I nodded, but the movement felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Because in that moment, I understood something in a way I never had before. I wasn't the girl my parents had thrown out. Not anymore. I wasn't the mistake they had decided I was. I was someone new. Someone responsible for another life. Someone who couldn't afford to fall apart. That night, after the nurses had come and gone, and the room had settled into that strange, quiet rhythm hospitals have in the early hours, I made myself a promise. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. I would build a life for him. Not the kind of life I had just lost. Something better. Something no one could take away. The first year blurred together in pieces. Diapers, bottles, sleepless nights that stretched into mornings without warning. Homework done at the kitchen table while gently rocking a bassinet with my foot. The constant low-level hum of worry about money, about time, about whether I was doing any of it right. Grandma made it feel possible. She drove me to every doctor's appointment in her old Chevy, the paint peeling in long, thin strips along the side. She cooked even when she said she wasn't hungry. She clipped coupons like it was a full-time job, stacking them neatly in a small tin box she kept beside the fridge. "You don't quit just because it's hard," she told me one morning as she handed me a bowl of oatmeal. "You get through it. One day at a time." I nodded even when I wasn't sure how. At night, when the house was quiet except for the soft breathing of my son and the occasional creak of the floorboards, I would sit at the table with my schoolwork spread out in front of me. Sometimes I cried. Quietly. Just enough to let the pressure out before pulling myself back together. Grandma never called attention to it. She would come into the kitchen in her robe, pretending she had just woken up, and gently lift him from my arms. "Finish what you started," she'd say. "I've got him." And I would. Because disappointing her felt worse than any exhaustion. I finished high school through an alternative program, balancing classes with feedings assignments, with doctor visits. When graduation came, I walked across that stage in a borrowed dress, my hand steady, even though my heart wasn't. Grandma sat in the front row, my son in her lap, dressed in a tiny shirt with a bow tie that kept slipping sideways. She clapped the loudest. My parents didn't come. I told myself it didn't matter. But when I saw other girls hugging their mothers, fathers, shaking hands with teachers, cameras flashing, I felt something inside me dip just slightly, like a floorboard giving under too much weight. Still, when I looked back at Grandma smiling, proud, completely certain I found my footing again. After graduation, I took whatever work I could find. Bagging groceries, stocking shelves, cleaning offices after hours, anything that brought in money, even if it wasn't much. I learned how to stretch $1 until it almost broke. Gas mileage mattered. Coupons mattered. Every small decision added up to something bigger, another week of groceries, another doctor visit, another step forward. But it wasn't enough. Not long term. I knew that. The realization settled in slowly like a truth I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. One afternoon, everything shifted. A man showed up at Grandma's house claiming he was a contractor, said the roof needed urgent repairs, talked fast, too fast, quoted a number that made my stomach tighten. Grandma stood on the porch listening, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't born yesterday," she said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, this is serious if you don't act now." "We're not signing anything I cut in." Both of them turned toward me. The man looked annoyed. Grandma looked curious. "If you don't leave," I continued, my voice steadier than I felt, "I'll call the sheriff." For a second I thought he might argue. Then he didn't. He left. Just like that. Grandma watched him go, then turned back to me slowly. "Well," she said, a hint of something like pride in her voice, "look at you." I shrugged, suddenly unsure of myself. "I just didn't trust him," I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You ever think about doing something with that?" she asked. "Like what?" "Law, military, something where you stand between people and the ones who try to take advantage of them." I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. "Me?" She didn't laugh. "Why not you?" The question stayed with me longer than I expected. A few weeks later, I saw a recruiter at a community event, Navy. He stood near a table with brochures talking to a small group of students. I wasn't planning to stop. I had my son on my hip, a list of errands in my head, and not enough time for something that felt unrealistic. But I slowed anyway. Listened. He talked about structure, opportunity, education, a future that didn't depend on where you started. I thought about the kitchen table at 2 a.m., about the grocery store, about the way Grandma coughed sometimes when she thought I couldn't hear, about my son. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I might be able to build. That night, after I put my son to sleep and Grandma had gone to bed, I sat at the table with the recruiter's card in my hand. My fingers traced the edges of it slowly. This wasn't just a job. It was a decision, a direction, a line drawn between who I had been and who I could become. I picked up a pen. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that gives you space to hear your own thoughts clearly. And then, without overthinking it, without giving myself time to doubt, I signed my name. Because if there was one thing I had learned since the night I stood on that porch with nowhere to go, it was this. If no one gives you a place in the world, you make one. Boot camp didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like being stripped down to something raw and unrecognizable. The first morning, the air cut through my lungs like it didn't belong there. Cold, sharp, unforgiving. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin, it gets inside you, settles into your bones, and stays there long after the sun comes up. I stood in a line of strangers, all of us silent, all of us trying to look like we belonged, even if none of us did yet. Someone shouted. Not angry, not personal, just loud enough to erase whatever version of yourself you had walked in with. That was the point. They didn't care who I had been before. They didn't care that I was 16 when my parents told me to leave, or that I had learned to stretch a box of cereal across 3 meals, or that I had rocked a baby to sleep while finishing homework at 2 in the morning. None of that mattered here. Here you were, what you could do, what you could endure, what you could become. The first few weeks were the hardest. Not because of the physical strain, though, that was there, constant and relentless, but because of the silence. The kind that settles in when you don't have time to think about anything except the next command, the next step, the next breath. There were nights I lay in my bunk, staring up at the underside of the bed above me, my body aching, my hands still tingling from the day's drills, and all I could think about was my son. What he was doing. If he had eaten. If he had asked for me. Grandma wrote letters. Short ones, mostly. Her handwriting, looping and uneven in places like the pen, had to work a little harder than it used to. He's growing fast, she wrote once. Started trying to say your name, sounds like Ma right now, but we'll get there. I read that line over and over again until the paper softened at the folds. Sometimes I would press the letter flat against my chest before putting it away, like I could hold on to the moment a little longer that way. I didn't cry. Not where anyone could see. I learned quickly that in a place like that, emotion wasn't something you displayed. It was something you carried, quietly, carefully. Like weight. And I had already learned how to carry weight. So I did what I had always done. I focused. On the drills. On the timing. On the details that turned chaos into structure. I listened more than I spoke, watched more than I reacted, learned where I could improve, where I needed to push harder, where I needed to hold steady. There were people who came in stronger than me, faster, more confident. People who had families cheering them on, writing letters filled with encouragement and pride. I had one letter at a time, and that was enough. Because every time I felt like I was reaching my limit, I remembered something Grandma had said once, standing in that kitchen while the coffee brewed and the sun came up slow through the window. "You're tougher than you think," she had told me. I didn't believe her then. I did now. When I graduated from training, there was a ceremony. Nothing extravagant. Rows of chairs, uniforms, pressed sharp, a handful of families in the crowd. I stood there in formation, my posture straight, my eyes forward. Grandma was there. She had made the trip, even though I knew it wasn't easy for her. She sat in the second row, my son in her lap, both of them bundled up against the wind. When the ceremony ended and we were dismissed, I walked toward them, my steps measured at first, then faster as the distance closed. Grandma stood carefully, one hand on the armrest for support, the other holding on to my son. "Well," she said, looking me up and down, her eyes shining, "would you look at that?" I smiled, a real one this time, not the controlled version I had learned to wear. "You made it," she said softly. I shook my head. "I'm just getting started." And I was. The years that followed didn't come with dramatic shifts or sudden breakthroughs. They came in increments, small, steady progress built on discipline and consistency. I took on assignments others didn't want. Stayed late when I needed to. Studied when no one was watching. I learned how to lead without raising my voice, how to make decisions under pressure, how to earn respect instead of demanding it. There were moments, brief ones, when doubt crept in. When I wondered if I was pushing too hard, if I was asking too much of myself, if I could keep balancing everything, the work, the responsibility, the distance from home. But every time that doubt surfaced, something else rose up with it. A memory. A door closing. A voice saying, "You've embarrassed us." And just like that, the doubt didn't stand a chance. Because I wasn't doing this to prove them wrong. Not anymore. I was doing it because this was who I had chosen to become. My son grew up alongside my career. Phone calls instead of bedtime stories, letters instead of goodnight kisses, visits that were never long enough but always meant more because of it. He never complained. Not once. When he was old enough to understand, he asked questions. "What do you do, Mom?" "I help keep people safe," I told him. He nodded like that made sense. "Like a superhero?" he asked once. I smiled. Something like that. Grandma stayed our constant. She kept the house steady, kept him grounded, kept me connected to something that felt like home even when I was halfway across the world. Her voice on the phone never changed. "You eating?" she would ask. "Yes, ma'am." "You sleeping?" "Trying to." "Good, that's all I need to hear." But time doesn't slow down for anyone. Not even for people who deserve more of it. The first time she fainted, I wasn't there. I heard about it hours later over a phone call that started with my son saying, "Mom, don't panic," which is exactly how you know you're about to. "I'm fine," Grandma insisted when I spoke to her, her voice thinner than I remembered. "Just got a little dizzy. Doctors always make a bigger deal out of things than they need to." But I heard it. The difference. The space between her words. The effort it took to say them. I arranged leave as soon as I could. When I walked into that hospital room, it felt smaller than it should have. Or maybe it was just that she looked smaller in it. Her hands, once steady and sure, rested lightly on the blanket veins, more visible now, skin thinner. But her eyes, they were the same. Sharp, warm, present. "Well, if it isn't my favorite overachiever," she said, a hint of a smile pulling at her lips. I sat beside her, careful with my movements, like anything too sudden might break the moment. "You scared me," I said. She shrugged as much as she could. "Still here," she replied. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not uncomfortable. Just full. "You've done good," she said eventually, her voice softer now. "Better than good." I looked down at my hands, then back at her. I had help, I said. She shook her head just slightly. You had strength, she corrected. I just reminded you it was there. I swallowed something tightening in my chest. I started then stopped. She watched me waiting. I wish they could see this, I finished quietly. She didn't ask who I meant. She knew. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. They made their choices, she said. You made yours. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't forgiving either. It was just true. And sometimes truth is the only thing that holds. Grandma passed on a quiet Tuesday morning. No alarms, no chaos, no long drawn-out goodbye that gives you time to prepare yourself. Just a call from the hospital, a soft voice on the other end, and a sentence that felt too simple to carry the weight of what it meant. She went peacefully. I remember standing in my kitchen when I heard it, one hand resting on the counter, the other still holding the phone long after the line had gone quiet. The house felt different immediately, like something fundamental had shifted, even though nothing had physically changed. My son stood in the doorway watching me. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He had learned in his own quiet way how to read the spaces between words. She's gone, I said. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening just a little, his shoulders straightening in that familiar way he had developed over the years, his version of holding himself together. Okay, he said. But the word didn't mean acceptance. It meant he understood that things would never be the same again. The funeral was small, just the way she would have wanted it. The church smelled faintly of old wood and polished pews, the kind that had seen generations come and go without ever changing. People filled the seats slowly, not in a rush, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to be there. Farmers, neighbors, women from her quilting group, people I recognized and people I didn't. One by one they stood and spoke. Not about grand accomplishments or dramatic moments, but about small things. Quiet things. She brought me groceries when my husband lost his job, one woman said, her voice trembling. She fixed my fence herself after the storm, an older man added, shaking his head like he still couldn't quite believe it. She never let anyone feel alone, someone else whispered. I sat there listening, my hands folded in my lap, and realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Grandma hadn't just saved me. She had been doing that quietly, consistently for people her entire life, without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return. After the service, people came up to me offering condolences, sharing memories, touching my arm like they were trying to pass some of that warmth on to me. You were lucky to have her, one woman said. I nodded. I know. What I didn't say was that she had been more than luck. She had been the reason I survived. A few days later, I received a call from her attorney. Whenever you're ready, he said gently, we should go over the will. I almost told him it could wait. That paperwork didn't matter right now. But Grandma had never been the type to leave things unfinished, and something about that made me pick up my keys and drive to his office anyway. It was a narrow brick building on Main Street, tucked between a barbershop and a bakery that smelled like cinnamon, no matter what time of day it was. Inside, the waiting room looked like it hadn't been updated in years. Mismatched chairs, old magazines, a clock that ticked just a little too loudly. Mr. Whitaker greeted me at the door. He was older now, his hair more gray than not, his glasses slipping down his nose as he spoke. Thank you for coming, he said. I know this isn't easy timing. It's okay, I replied. She wouldn't want me to put it off. He nodded as if that confirmed something he already believed. We sat across from each other at his desk, a folder placed neatly between us. Your grandmother was very thorough, he began. She made her intentions very clear. I nodded. That sounds like her. He opened the folder, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the first page. She named you her sole beneficiary. That part didn't surprise me. There wasn't anyone else. She didn't have much, I said quietly. Just the house, maybe some savings. He paused, then looked up at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. Actually, he said gently, she had more than that. The room felt smaller all of a sudden. What do you mean? He turned the folder toward me, sliding it across the desk. Several years ago, your grandmother sold a portion of her land, the wooded acreage behind the house. I frowned slightly. I remember the land. I didn't know it was worth anything. At the time, he said a development company was very interested in it. They made a substantial offer. My eyes moved over the paperwork, contracts, financial statements, numbers that didn't quite make sense at first. She invested the proceeds, he continued, carefully, conservatively, over time with interest. He hesitated as if choosing his next words carefully. The total value of the estate is approximately $3.2 million. The number didn't register right away. It just sat there. Heavy. Unreal. 3.2 million, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. I know it's a lot to take in. I leaned back in the chair, my hand coming up to cover my mouth as I tried to process it. Grandma. The same woman who clipped coupons, who wore the same winter coat year after year, who insisted on fixing things herself instead of paying someone else. She had been sitting on that kind of money and never said a word. She didn't want you to know, Mr. Whitaker said, as if reading my thoughts. She was very clear about that. Why? He gave a small understanding smile. Because she knew you. She knew you would have tried to make her spend it. And she wanted you to build your life on your own first. My chest tightened. That sounds like her, I said softly. He reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. There's also this, he added, handing it to me. It was a letter. Her handwriting. I recognized it instantly. She asked that you read it after everything was finalized, he said. I didn't read it there. I couldn't. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my bag, my fingers lingering on it for just a second longer than necessary. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and decisions. Accounts transferred, documents signed, numbers that once felt abstract slowly becoming something real. But I didn't rush to spend it. I couldn't. Because every dollar felt like it carried her with it. Instead, I set aside a portion to create a small scholarship, something for young mothers trying to finish school, something that might give someone else the same kind of second chance she had given me. I made sure my son's future was secure. And the rest, I left untouched, at least for the moment. I wanted to be careful, deliberate, the way she had been. For a brief period, life felt steady. Not easy, but grounded. Until the phone call came. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something instinct maybe made me answer. Hello? There was a pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. It's your father. Everything inside me went still. I heard about your grandmother, he continued. And the will. There it was. No hesitation. No acknowledgement of the years between. We should talk, he said. The line clicked dead before I could respond. 2 days later, a letter arrived. Neatly written, formal, controlled. They believed the inheritance should be shared. They expected a portion. They were prepared to take legal action if necessary. I stood in my kitchen, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. No apology. No regret. No mention of the night they told me to leave. Just a claim. A demand. For something they had no part in earning. I let out a slow breath, folding the letter carefully. From the living room, my son watched me. What is it, he asked? I met his eyes. Something we're going to have to deal with, I said. He nodded once. Okay. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. They hadn't come back for me. They had come back for what they thought they could take. And this time, I wasn't 16 anymore. The morning of the hearing arrived without ceremony. No dramatic sunrise. No sense that something monumental was about to happen. Just a quiet, steady kind of light filtering through the curtains, the same way it had every other day. The world, as it often does, continued on without acknowledging that, for me, this was a line being drawn. I stood in my bedroom for a moment before getting dressed, looking at my reflection with a kind of detached calm I hadn't always known how to find. The suit I chose was simple, navy, clean lines, no jewelry except a watch I'd worn for years. My hair pulled back, precise, controlled. Not because I wanted to impress anyone in that courtroom. Because I had learned over time that presentation is a language. And I intended to be understood. My son was already awake when I walked into the kitchen, sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood in a rhythm that told me he was thinking. You ready? He asked without looking up. As I'll ever be, I said. He nodded, then finally met my eyes. They don't get to win this, he said. It wasn't a question. I allowed myself a small smile. No, I said, they don't. We didn't say much after that. There are moments when words don't add anything. They just fill space that doesn't need filling. The courthouse looked the same as it had the week before. Brick, glass, flags moving slightly in the breeze. Inside, the air carried that familiar mix of paper polish and something older beneath it, like history pressed into the walls. People had come. Not a crowd exactly, but more than you'd expect for a case like this. Small towns don't ignore stories like ours. They absorb them, pass them along, add their own interpretations until the truth becomes something shared. I walked through the hallway without rushing. Not slow. Just steady. My parents were already there. Of course they were. They stood near the entrance to the courtroom, their attorney beside them, speaking in low, measured tones. My mother's posture was rigid, her purse held tight against her side. My father's hands were clasped behind his back, his stance firm, like he was preparing for something he believed he understood. When they saw me, the conversation paused. My mother's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but something close enough to pass for one if you didn't look too closely. My father tilted his head, studying me. "You came alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not alone," I replied. He glanced briefly around the hallway as if expecting someone else to step forward. No one did. He nodded once as though confirming something to himself. "You always did think you could handle everything on your own," he said. I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to prove to him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere settled quickly into that familiar quiet. Wooden benches, the soft shuffle of papers, the low murmur of voices that faded the moment the bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." We stood. The judge entered, his expression neutral, his movements deliberate. He took his seat, adjusted the files in front of him, and glanced briefly across the room. And then, his gaze stopped. On me. The recognition was immediate. Not exaggerated. Not performative. Just real. He inclined his head slightly. "Good morning," he said. Then with the same calm authority, he added Admiral. The word landed. Soft. Final. Across the room I heard it before I saw it, the sharp intake of breath from my mother. My father's head turned so quickly it almost seemed involuntary, his eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile what he had just heard with the version of me he had carried for 2 decades. Their attorney blinked once, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. It wasn't shock that filled the room. It was recalibration. Everything they thought they knew about this case, about me, about their position in it, changed. The judge continued as if nothing unusual had happened, moving through the formalities with practiced ease. But the air was different now. Heavier. More precise. My parents sat down slowly, their earlier confidence no longer sitting quite as comfortably on their shoulders. The proceedings began. Their attorney stood first, clearing his throat, his voice smooth and controlled. "Your Honor, we are here today to address the distribution of the estate belonging to Margaret." He spoke at length, building his argument carefully. That my grandmother had been influenced. That her decision had been compromised. That I in some way had guided her choices for my own benefit. The words were polished. Strategic. Designed to create doubt. But there's a difference between an argument and the truth. And truth has a way of holding its shape under pressure. When it was our turn, my attorney Rachel stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She began with the facts. Medical records confirming my grandmother's mental clarity over the years leading up to her passing. Documentation of the land sale. Financial statements showing consistent, deliberate investments. Witness signatures. Legal filings. Everything aligned. She wasn't confused, Rachel said calmly. She was intentional. The judge nodded slightly, making notes. Rachel continued. And perhaps most importantly, she added, there is no evidence of any ongoing relationship between the petitioners and the deceased for over 20 years. A pause. Then she placed a file on the table. School records, medical documents, statements from educators and community members, all confirming that the respondent, she gestured lightly toward me, was removed from her parents' home at the age of 16 while pregnant, and received no further support or contact from them thereafter. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud, but present. My father shifted in his seat. My mother looked down at her hands. When my father was called to the stand, he straightened his shoulders, stepping forward with the same controlled confidence he had carried in the hallway. I didn't abandon her, he said. Rachel didn't react immediately. She left, he added. Rachel tilted her head slightly. She left, she repeated, at 16, pregnant, without resources. He hesitated. We were overwhelmed, he said. She made choices. Rachel's voice remained steady. And what lesson was she meant to learn by being without a home? He didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. When my mother took the stand, she chose a different approach. Tears. Her voice trembled, her hands twisting a tissue between her fingers. I loved her, she said. I still do. Rachel nodded once. In the 20 years following that night, she asked, how many birthdays did you acknowledge? My mother's voice faltered. None. Graduations. No. Did you ever meet your grandson? Silence. No. Rachel held her gaze. Would you say those are the actions of a loving parent? My mother looked down. Her silence answered the question more clearly than words ever could. The final piece came in the form of a letter. Handwritten. My grandmother's. Rachel read it aloud, her voice measured, respectful. She built a life they tried to deny her. Everything I leave behind is meant to protect that life and the one she has built for her child. The room went still. The judge leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged but his focus sharp. When both sides had finished, he took a moment. Just a moment. Then he spoke. This is not a close case, he said. His voice carried evenly across the room. The evidence clearly supports the validity of the decedent's will. There is no indication of undue influence or lack of capacity. A pause. Then, the petition is denied in full. Denied. A single word. But it moved through the room like something solid. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension draining out of them in a way that made him look older than he had when he walked in. Their attorney closed his briefcase slowly, carefully, as if anything abrupt might break something already fragile. Beside me, Rachel leaned in just enough for her voice to reach me. It's over, she said. I nodded. But the truth was, it didn't feel like the end. Not yet. Because winning a case isn't the same as closing a chapter. And as I stood there watching the two people who had once defined my entire world shrink into something smaller, something quieter, I realized this moment wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about finally standing in a place where they no longer had the power to define me at all. When the courtroom began to empty, the noise didn't come back all at once. It returned in layers. First, the soft scrape of chairs against the floor. Then the murmur of voices, low, careful, like people weren't quite sure what they had just witnessed, or how loudly they were allowed to react to it. Papers were gathered, bags lifted, doors opened and closed with quiet finality. I stayed where I was for a moment longer. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to feel the stillness settle properly. Rachel touched my arm lightly. You handled that with more composure than most people ever could. Thank you, I said. You want me to walk you out? I shook my head. I'll be all right. She studied me for a second, then nodded. Call me if anything comes up. I will. When she left, the space around me widened in a way that felt both relieving and unfamiliar. For so many years I had been moving forward, always forward, from one responsibility to the next, from one decision to another. There hadn't been much room to stop. Now there was. And I wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. I picked up my coat and turned toward the back exit, the quieter one, away from the main hallway where people would still be lingering. The sound of footsteps behind me stopped me before I reached the door. Wait. I turned. My father. He stood a few feet away, his posture no longer as rigid as it had been earlier. My mother hovered slightly behind him, her hand still wrapped around her purse, though now it looked less like something she was protecting and more like something she didn't know what to do with. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was heavy, full of things that had been unsaid for far too long. We didn't know, my father said finally. His voice was quieter now. Not weaker. Just stripped of something it had carried before. I held his gaze. You didn't want to know, I replied. He flinched slightly, the words landing exactly where they were meant to. My mother swallowed, her eyes red, her composure fraying at the edges. We didn't think you would, she began, then trailed off as if the rest of the sentence didn't belong in the open air. Become what I asked. She didn't answer. Because we all knew. My father exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction. We were wrong, he said. The words hung there, unfamiliar, like something he had never practiced saying. My mother nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. We were ashamed, she added softly, and we thought, if we ignored it, it would go away. I let that sit between us. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Not cruelty for the sake of cruelty. Not hatred. Just pride. Fear. And the kind of shame that makes people turn away from what they should be holding on to the tightest. I needed you when I was 16, I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It just existed. Clear, steady, unavoidable. My mother covered her mouth, her shoulders trembling. I know, she whispered. My father looked down, then back up again, like he was trying to hold eye contact, but didn't quite feel like he had earned it. We can't change that, he said. No, I agreed, you can't. Another pause. Longer this time. But we're not here for the money anymore, he added. I studied him, trying to see if there was anything in his expression that suggested otherwise. For the first time since I had seen him again, there wasn't. That didn't fix anything. It didn't undo anything. But it mattered. Just a little. That's not what this was about, I said. He frowned slightly. What was it about then? I took a slow breath. The fact that the first time you came back into my life was when there was something to take. The words didn't come out sharp. They didn't need to. They carried their own weight. My mother's shoulders dropped like something inside her had finally given way. We were cowards, she said. My father nodded once. We were, he agreed. There was no defense. No excuse. Just acknowledgement. And for a moment that was enough. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just truth. I glanced past them toward the exit. I have to go, I said. My son would be waiting. He always was. My father stepped aside. My mother wiped her eyes, her voice barely audible. We're sorry. I gave a small nod. Not acceptance. Not rejection. Just recognition. Then I walked past them. The air outside was cooler than I expected, the late afternoon light stretching long across the pavement. The sky had that same quiet stillness it had carried the night I left their house, but this time it felt different. Not empty. Just open. When I got home, my son was at the kitchen table exactly where I knew he would be, his hands tapping lightly against the surface again. He stood up as soon as I walked in. Well, he asked. We won, I said. Relief washed over his face immediately. Good, he said. They didn't deserve. I raised a hand gently. They're still your grandparents. He hesitated. Are they? He asked. I pulled out a chair and sat down, motioning for him to do the same. People make mistakes, I said. Big ones. And sometimes they don't understand what they've done until it's too late to fix it. He considered that. So what now? I looked at him. At the way he had grown into himself. At the steadiness in his eyes. At the quiet strength that had nothing to do with where he came from, and everything to do with how he had been raised. Now I said we don't let this define us. He nodded slowly. Grandma wouldn't want that, he said. I smiled. No, I agreed, she wouldn't. That night after he went to bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The same porch where Grandma and I had sat so many evenings watching the sun go down, talking about things that felt small at the time, but turned out to matter more than anything. The air was still. The kind of still that doesn't press in on you but settles around you gently. I looked up at the sky, the stars faint but present. I hope I made you proud, I said quietly. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for an answer. I already knew. She hadn't just given me money. She hadn't just given me a place to stay. She had given me something far more valuable. The ability to stand on my own. To build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. To walk away from the past without letting it follow me. And maybe that was the real victory. Not the courtroom. Not the verdict. But the fact that I could stand here now, whole, steady, and at peace, and know that the girl who once stood shivering on a porch with nowhere to go had become someone who didn't need to ask for a place in the world anymore. If this story stayed with you, if even a small part of it felt familiar or real or worth holding on to, then I hope you'll take a moment to share it. Leave a comment, tell me where you're listening from, or simply let someone in your life know they matter. We all carry stories we don't always speak out loud. And sometimes hearing someone else's is what reminds us we're not alone. There are more stories like this, quiet ones, strong ones, real ones waiting to be told. So if you'd like to keep listening, I'd be glad to have you here.